信じるものすべて掴んでたあの頃
What the f did I just play? Well, I'm probably going to regret making this video. But before we start, let's first add some context. If one were to list the greatest scenario writers in the visual novel medium, Tanaka Romeo would undoubtedly be up there, possibly fighting for the first position alongside other big names like Maruto Fumiaki, Mureni, or Shimonyu. Or at least that would be the case if you asked a Japanese reader, since unfortunately most of his works have received a rather muted reception here in the West. Let's take Kazoku Keikaku as an example, with it not even reaching a 7.5 rating on VNDB, despite being considered one of the best titles of that era. And do I even need to mention Cross-Channel and its infamous translations? Among his works, Saihate no Ima has always carried a certain type of mystique. Most people who have played it would agree it's one of the most intricate and complexly written pieces of narrative art in this medium. Having now finished it myself, I can strongly agree. To be honest, I feel like I can review the experience of playing Saihate no Ima, but I have no confidence in my ability to actually review Saihate no Ima itself. So I guess think of this video as some sort of first impressions video or overall visual novel recommendation rather than a fully fledged, exhaustive analysis of this work. I think that type of video would end up being 10 hours long. No exaggeration. Hey there, this is Miran, and this is my kinda but not really review of Saihate no Ima.
Story.
Okay, so this should be the part of the video where I do a brief summary of the plot, but how does one even summarize Saihate no Ima? I guess one could take the official story synopsis as a reference, which simply says that this is a story about 7 friends whose peaceful days were interrupted by an unspecified enemy. And sure, that's kind of what the story's about, if you summarize it in strokes broader than the ocean. The game begins with the protagonist, Shinobu, having a barbecue tea party with his friends. But everything after that is just a series of scenes seemingly stitched together at random, full of constant flashbacks and lacking any sense of continuity. It feels like it goes back and forth, then backwards, then forwards, then upside down, then jumps through a hoop, then does a loop-de-loop, then backwards again. This incoherent approach eventually makes sense, but at first it can admittedly be very disorienting. That being said, it's hard to be bothered by this when each individual scene is so fascinating. Here's where Romeo's immaculate writing comes into play. If I were to describe his style, it would be sharp, concise, yet extraordinarily profound, especially when it comes to his world building and character development. To illustrate what makes his cast so in-depth, let's look at some typical character tropes. In a basic visual novel, a situation of conflict appears between the protagonist and the girl, possibly due to a simple misunderstanding that then gets resolved, leading to the romantic phase of the story. In a more well-developed narrative, this friction would simply be the kickstart of this character's arc, with the plot focusing instead on seeking the reason that made her that way and finding a solution from there. However, in Saihate no Ima, the story not only questions what caused that character's identity formation, but also why and from where these changes occurred. It then takes that character exploration and contextualizes it within a societal framework to further establish their individuality and personal struggles. Likewise, Romero's extensive knowledge of philosophical, psychological, and sociological concepts brings a rich and dense layer of meaningful implications to the entire narrative that organically ties everything together wonderfully. I think revealing anything more would inevitably mean stepping into spoiler territory, but one final thing regarding his writing that deserves mention is the humor. The dynamic interactions between the members of the cast were one of the highlights of this VN for me. There's a point in the story where the game shows you something resembling a relationship chart, providing a snapshot of each character's perspective and feelings toward the others. And it just struck me with how accurate it felt despite the game never explicitly stating these dynamics before. This variety is what made the jokes work so well. It kind of felt like each character was a different musical instrument, offering different colors for each combination. It's fairly evident how Romeo was simply having fun writing their interactions, especially with Yoko.
Oh!
However, I'm sure the first thing that will catch most new players' attention is the hyperlink system. How it works is that every once in a while, the text will have certain words or phrases underlined, and clicking them will bring up a sometimes short, sometimes longer piece of information. These could range from an event that took place in the game's universe, a trivia tidbit, or even a scene relevant to what's going on at that moment. It's like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. This also replaces the traditional choice-based system from most visual novels. During the first 2 or so scenes, the first link you click will determine which route you get into. After that, it's a fairly linear affair. Overall, I felt this was a very clever and organic addition, or better said, readaptation of existing ideas of the medium within the narrative framework. There's only one teeny-weeny problem with these. Do you see this cute little info dumping tag on the game's VNDB page with a 2.9 rating? Yeah, 2.9 my ass. That number should be 29,000. The sheer amount of info dumping in this game is absolutely insane. If you thought the expository sections in other VNs like Move Love or Muramasa were intense, those feel like child's play in comparison to Saihate no Ima. As much as I appreciate the hyperlink system, there were moments when it simply crossed the line for me. Keep in mind that it's not rare to have hyperlinks within the hyperlinks. It honestly feels like you are, at times, playing a Wikipedia simulator. And then, once you have waddled through countless lines of text and finally resurfaced to the actual plot, dazed and confused, you kind of need a moment to readjust your head and refocus on the already disorienting story. This game absolutely lives up to its Namkai reputation. At the same time, it's hard to shake the feeling that all of this was done on purpose. This is the type of VN that you are meant to read multiple times in order to fully experience it and absorb all it has to offer. This is mainly due to one particular plot revelation, which needless to say, I'm not going to reveal here. In a way, it reminds me of Remember 11, where the game doesn't directly give you all the answers, but rather expects you to connect the dots by yourself. The issue, though, is that there's like 1,000 dots scattered all over the place, meaning that it's nearly impossible to retain all that information in your head. This is essentially why I said that I can only give you something akin to my first impressions, despite me having already finished the game. Hence this quote-unquote review. Honestly, I feel like I'm just scratching the surface of this game here, or perhaps the surface of its surface. I'm not going to lie, there's a part of me that feels it's a bit tone-deaf to discuss something as superficial as the presentation aspect of this VN, but I do have a couple of points I want to bring up. Regarding its visuals, while I can't say that this game is a looker, I do kind of like its art style, especially the character design. Plus, there's a considerably high amount of CGs during the first 2/3 of the story. However, I felt like the final chapter lacked visual variation, making some scenes feel slightly more obtuse than they needed to. I've seen talks that some parts of the game were left unfinished, so perhaps this is a result of that. As for the audio, it's good but nothing remarkable. The music, for instance, is overall really solid, but most of the main tracks have such a melancholic tone that I ended up muting it entirely, as it became too distracting for me. Also, let's talk about Satie's Gymnopédie number 1 for a second. Look, I like the piece, and I know it makes narrative sense in this game, more so if you check the expression indication on the score. But I must admit that I'm pretty tired of hearing it for the 3,000th time in a visual novel. There are so many titles that include this exact same piece that I think VNDB should consider, including a tag for it. What frustrates me is that there are so many other great compositions from that era that they could choose instead. Why not go with Debussy's Petite Suite, or Ravel's Miroir, or his Tombeau de Couperin? Now that's some impressionist kino. I will say though, I find it pretty amusing that they gave Sadie a special thanks in the credits. To conclude, Saihate no Ima feels like such an oddity within the medium. The depth of its messaging is simply unparalleled. To be honest, I don't think there's ever going to be anything remotely like it. And for that reason alone, to me this title is easily a must-read. At the same time, it's difficult to deny that the excessive amount of exposition doesn't affect the overall pacing, making some parts of the game quite exhausting to go through. I know the expression, "it's not for everyone," is one of the most cop-out phrases a reviewer can use, since that's literally the case for every single piece of media. But for Saihate no Ima, it rings especially true. If you have a low tolerance for info dumping, you will probably drop this game midway through, and I honestly wouldn't blame you for doing so. But if you have the mental endurance to stick with it until the end, all the while soaking up and reflecting on what it has to say, I can safely say this will provide you with plenty of thought material, perhaps more than you bargained for. I guess this would be the part of the video where I give the game a numerical score, but even that feels somewhat wrong. Sure, I can score it based on my personal enjoyment, but giving it a number here would essentially mean directly comparing it to other visual novels. Saihate no Ima, though, goes for something so radically different that it doesn't make much sense for me to put it in the same category. And that's going to wrap up this review, first impressions, overview, whatever you want to call it video. I actually thought about using the YouTube card feature for this video to simulate the hyperlink stuff, but decided not to, because who even clicks those? At the very least, I hope this has helped you better grasp what type of game this is and why it is so highly praised. By the way, if you have been wondering why I hadn't posted a regular review in roughly 3 weeks, it's because I was trying my best to finish this. It's kind of amusing this ended up being the next video after the untranslatable VNs one, because I absolutely do not see this ever being translated into English. Anyway, that's all I have to say about it for now. As always, thanks for watching. Mirin out.